All sport, including elite and intermediate level sports, requires players to use the ATP-CP system as well as the anaerobic and aerobic systems. The ATP-CP system creates energy in the body by breaking down the chemical fuel creatine phosphate, which helps the body to explode at high intensity rates due to the chemical breakdown. However, the system is limited to by the amount of creatine phosphate in the muscles. ATP-CP consists of 1 adenosine molecule, 3 phosphate molecules, and 1 creatine molecule. The anaerobic, also known as lactic acid system, is also involved in providing energy for the body. It uses glycogen for fuel, which is stored in the muscle and liver. The anaerobic system's peak power is after 5 to 15 seconds and is dominant for a period of 5 to 60 seconds and yields small amounts of ATP. The aerobic system has a longer duration and a high intensity energy supply when ATP-CP is depleted. The aerobic system does not require oxygen to be delivered to the muscle to make a quicker release of energy. However, because of this, it also creates our body to become more fatigued. This is because accumulation of lactic acid and hydrogen ions. After the completion of exercise, recovery is needed to help remove the consumption of lactic acid built up. Active recovery removes the lactic acid faster than passive recovery. As shown, active recovery takes 45 minutes to bring down the lactic acid to 5%, while passive recovery brings it down to 2% in 90 minutes. The ATP-CP can restore from passive recovery. Depending on how much passive recovery you do will determine how much creatine phosphate is re-recovered. The anaerobic system partially breaks down energy stored within the glycogen molecule to rebuild the ATP-CP system. This process includes a series of chemical reactions that break down glucose into pyruvic acid, which produces enough energy to rebuild 2 ATP-CP molecules. The aerobic system helps athletes to recover from high-intensity exercise when the anaerobic system has been dominant. The aerobic system will help athletes that are fatigued to recover by supplying energy to the CP molecule as well as removed accumulation lactic acid and hydrogen ions in the muscles. After the exercise session has finished, recovery will begin. Oxygen deficit is the amount by which the oxygen supply does not meet the oxygen demand. This works by breathing in, transporting around the cardiovascular system, then utilizing it. After experiencing oxygen deficit, athletes will then experience a steady state in which oxygen supply equals the oxygen demands. The oxygen consumption will remain elevated for some time after the exercise is finished. This is called excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption, also known as EPOC or oxygen debt. EPOC helps replenish ATP-CP and removal of blood lactate. It is important to remember that all the systems contribute at the same time and is never just one. When saying dominant, this means that one system will be working harder for the body to utilize the needed energy. I will be analyzing the energy system contribution of an elite mid and wing player in touch football and comparing the contributions of amateur players within our PE class. Peter Norman is a midfielder that plays in the Australian touch football team. The midfielder position is a high energy position that requires a lot of running and high intensity physical exertion. This requires athletes that play the midfield position to be able to perform high intensity bursts over a long period of time. The game starts with New Zealand starting with the ball, making Australia on defence. At the start of the game, Norman's aerobic system is dominant, with the ATP-CP system contributing at 90%, the anaerobic and aerobic both contributing at 5% each. This is because he is standing still and his oxygen levels meet the oxygen demands. Norman is also using his aerobic after the whistle blows when Norman instantly runs backwards. However, his ATP-CP system is dominant straight after. This is because Norman creates a short-term burst of exercise when he gets his first defensive touch. As there is an increase of physical activity, Norman is now experiencing oxygen deficit, meaning the aerobic system will be dominant during this period. The energy that Norman is now using is being created anaerobically as he needs to restore his ATP-CP system from using the lactic acid system to partially break down some of the energy stored within the glycogen molecule. After making the defensive touch, Norman makes a high-intensity sprint down to the line which causes the ATP-CP system to slowly deplete. As Norman has had 5 seconds of high-intensity effort, his ATP-CP system has depleted to 50%, and both of his aerobic and anaerobic systems both contribute 25% each. After the fumble, Norman is doing a passive recovery by walking backwards waiting for the ball to come back into play. During the passive recovery, he is experiencing EPOC. 20 seconds of the game has passed, which means Norman's lactic acid system is contributing a lot more than the aerobic and ATP-CP system. After the quick recovery time, Norman catches the ball and makes another high-intensity outburst where he will then complete his first rubble. His anaerobic glycosis is predominant and his ATP-CP system is depleted to 7%. His anaerobic is contributing 63% and his aerobic system is contributing 30%. Norman is now experiencing the lactate in his blood beginning to accumulate at an accelerated rate. This is also known as the onset of blood lactate or OBLA. Norman runs off the field for his first substitution. Norman spends a total of time of 2 minutes and 31 seconds on the bench. Norman is using passive recovery to decrease the amount of lactic acid in his blood. As Norman is off the bench for 151 seconds, his CP stores is restored by 97%. Norman's aerobic system will contribute by very little, approximately 5%, as his oxygen levels meet the oxygen demands, and his anaerobic system will also be contributing by 5% as he is walking up and down the sidelines. Sean Francis is another Australian touch footballer who is alongside with Peter Norman. The winger position occupies the outside of the field, which is positioned in between the link player and the sideline. The winger winger is usually the fastest player on the team as they must cover the large part of the field. This requires the wingers to have a predominant anaerobic system as well as a strong ATP-CP system. At the start of the second half, Francis starts on the field closest to the camera. As he has just had a 5-minute halftime break, this allowed for his ATP-CP system to recover. Francis hasn't had a high-intensity running outburst for a while, which means that the ATP-CP system has recovered to 98%. His anaerobic and aerobic system will also be contributing about 5% each. Throughout the game, the ball majority stays in the middle of the field. This causes Francis to walk up the field in offensive play. However, during defense, he's making a high-intensity effort by running backwards and pushing off to make another high-intensity outburst to make a defensive touch. Francis's ATP-CP becomes dominant when he's making a high-intensity outburst. This is shown when Francis attempts a try. After his high-intensity outburst, he is experiencing oxygen deficit, also known as EPOC. Throughout the next 30 seconds, he's doing a passive recovery where he's walking off the lactic acid buildup. This 30-second recovery will also help Francis to restore the CP stores by 50%. However, this 50% will quickly deplete as Francis has another high-intensity outburst after he catches a ball thrown by Norman by having a sprinting effort to get a try. During PE practical lessons, our class has gone out in the fields and played 3 games of touch football. During these 3 games, we each played different positions to help us get good experience and understanding of how the positions affect the systems differently. At the start of the game, my ATP-CP system is at 90% and both my anaerobic and aerobic is at 5%. However, as I make an explosive movement to run next to another player, my ATP-CP will become dominant and quickly deplete to 50% as there was an increase in demand for energy. After the explosive movement, my heart rate became more rapid as there is an increase of oxygen consumption. This graph shows my average heart rate and maximum heart rate for the following times of 9:30 am, 9:48 am, and 10:01 am. I then am recovering passively afterwards as I am walking up and down the field. The passive recovery is helping me to restore the creatine phosphate from resting my body without effort or any maximal energy output. As I've restored the CP in my ATP-CP system, I make another high-intensity effort when I catch the ball and run with it, which means my ATP-CP system is predominant, meaning that I'm making a short-term explosive movement without the need of excessive oxygen intake. At the same time, while running with the ball, I dodge a player, which is an outburst, which also means my ATP-CP is dominant during this period. After the short-term explosive effort, I'm recovering passively, which is helping me to restore my CP stores. I have an 18-second of recovery time, which is allowing for my CP stores to restore to around 30%. From the videos collected, I start off playing in the midfield, but I end up in the winger position. So to analyse the midfielder, I will utilise another student within our class referred to as the midfielder. The midfielder starts off with his aerobic system being dominant. This is because he hasn't made any exercise movement, so his oxygen supply is meeting his oxygen demands. However, the midfielder's ATP-CP system will soon be dominant as he catches the ball and instantly sprints forward. After making this movement, his heart rate will spike and he will experience EPOC. After making a high-intensity effort, the midfielder is now actively recovering as the lactate in his bloodstream is accumulating. The active recovery will also help him to restore his CP for future short-term explosives, which he will soon use. As the midfielder only recovered under 10 seconds, his CP stores is only restored by very little. The midfielder catches the ball again and makes another short-term outburst where he's using his lactic acid system. As before, he then experiences heart rate spiking and EPOC. During these games, there was only 1 bench per team, which didn't allow that many substitutions, which made our class to experience fatigue by the end of the game. Norman had 10 substitutions for the game he played, while the midfielder only experienced 2. This didn't allow the midfielder's ATP-CP system to restore by a great amount compared to what Norman's ATP-CP system was restored to. As Francis is a winger, he will have longer periods of game time compared to Norman. This is because Francis does not have as much high-intensity efforts as Norman does. Compared to Norman, Francis's ATP-CP energy system will be restored more as he is constantly doing a lot of passive recovery while Norman enters and exits the field more often. However, Francis and I both had limited amounts of substitutions, but we have had recovery time to restore our ATP-CP system from walking up and down the field. As we had time to recover, our aerobic system was being utilised to help our oxygen supply meet our oxygen demands. Energy systems are required for everyday movements such as getting out of bed to running in a game of touch football. The ATP-CP, anaerobic and aerobic systems all contribute at the same time and never just one. However, different systems can be dominant during different periods of exercise. From what I have learned, the midfield requires a strong ATP-CP system as well as an aerobic system for recovery time, while the winger doesn't need such a strong ATP-CP system as they have more time for recovery, while on the other hand, the midfielders need regular substitution.